Thank you, Kristen, and thanks for this opportunity. It's great to be back, finally, in person, and to be with all of you. One of the aspects of my work here at the MFA that I most enjoy is teaching. And this afternoon, I will be teaching a group of teens in a course called Curatorial Study Hall, where we are looking at works of art that in some way or another address the question, what does democracy look like in works of art as it's represented, also in objects that from ancient Greece were used in the implementation of democracy. So that's been really fun. You heard from my colleagues last week, Christine Condolian and Laura Marest, and if they didn't share with you our wonderful highlights guide, this is a wonderful way to access the collection. It was published in 2009, and in many ways, the layout of the galleries that we've been working towards over the last decade mirrors the book. So I suggest that if you're really interested, that you find it in our bookshop. So the subject today of my lecture is a new installation of early Greek art dating from 900 BC until the Persian invasion of Greece in 480. And by the way, on your handout, I define early Greek as this broader period, and then geometric, I'll sometimes use that word, 900 to 700 BCE, and archaic is 700 to 480 BCE. That is the Persian invasion of Greece, and you'll hear those terms. And I've also, just to orient you to the handout, listed names of people you'll hear about, so writers from Greece, Homer, Euripides, and Herodotus, then some gods and heroes, which we won't focus too much on today, but they will come up, some Greek names of Greeks that we know that were real people who lived in addition to writers, and then some peoples on the back, some places. It's very difficult to find a map that captures all the places that I will mention without a ton of other places that will confuse you. So I just list them here in the spellings that you can look them up on Google and find them yourself. And then lastly, further reading. So not only the highlights, but a couple of recent textbook-like books, including Jonathan Hall's The History of Archaic Greece, of the Archaic Greek World. So, the MFA has one of the oldest and most distinguished collections of Greek and Roman antiquities in America, and this especially applies to early Greek. The Early Greek Gallery is one of 5 new galleries at the MFA that opened in December of last year. And the map you see here on the right represents the master plan of Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Etruscan art as conceived by Christine Condolian in 2006. And that was part of an effort to rationalize the presentation. She may have mentioned, if you nod your head if there was discussion about this last week. I wasn't able to attend, but that in 2006 there was a decision to put all of Greek, Roman, Etruscan, and Byzantine art on the second floor of the ancient wing, and for Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern to be on the first floor. This is sounding familiar? Okay, great. And on the left is a timeline of the galleries that we've renovated during the past decade, with the most recent group highlighted in orange on the right. I've been part of almost all of these, which has been a great privilege. I came straight from graduate school in 2008 to work with Christine on a special exhibition called Aphrodite and the Gods of Love. Did any of you see that exhibition? And have been working at her side ever since then. So, these renovations include significant architectural and systems upgrades, the addition of air conditioning, entirely new custom-designed casework made by Gopion in Milan, and in the most recent phase, the addition of clear-story windows in 2 of the galleries. One is the one that you heard from Laura about last week, the Gods and Goddesses Gallery. And this necessitated the raising of the ceiling height by between 8 and 10 feet. Renovating the galleries in stages has some inefficiencies from a financial and possibly a project management perspective. However, some of the advantages of rolling them out over a period of time are the opportunity to learn from visitor feedback. And we have done some considerable studies, visitor studies, and we're really eager. I'm looking at Barbara to do, even though this isn't her remit anymore, but we're really eager to do more about this project. So to learn from visitor feedback and the ability to be responsive to the rapidly changing world around us. This includes refining our interpretive strategies to be more inclusive and engaging than ever. In our recent project, we were more intentionally collaborative, more outward-facing, and more visitor-centric than ever before. And not only have the galleries been very well received by our visitors, but also the process was deeply satisfying on a professional level. The work product is stronger when we do it together, and a talented team of conservators, mount makers, designers, interpreters, and many others made the work I'm about to share possible. And I'll just say that we really did work together from an earlier stage in the curatorial vision of these galleries than we had previously. And particularly, and I'll show the reasons why in just a moment, or they'll evolve over time in the course of the lecture, particularly for early Greek art, which was something of a blank slate. And we were able in this project to do more, frankly, than we thought we could. And we were very fortunate to have donors that came along with our vision. And so I had a particular challenge in conceiving of how to present this really extraordinary collection. It was a little bit daunting, but I'm very pleased with the results. Before I go into depth regarding the early Greek gallery, I'd like to frame it literally in the broader context of the presentation of archaic and classical Greek art at the MFA. In approaching the early Greek gallery, I analogized it to a lecture course in which visitors are exposed to the fundamentals of Greek art so that they can engage more deeply with the seminar-style thematic galleries in the adjacent spaces. As it happened, we were able to bring the thematic galleries to fruition first. And so part of my curatorial process was to look back at what we'd already done and find the gaps in an effort to provide a solid foundation. So I'm referring to the galleries on either side of the early Greek gallery that I showed in the map just before. In 2015, we opened a suite of 3 interrelated galleries: Homer and the Epics, Dionysus and the Symposium, and Greek theater. The Homer Gallery, which I curated, partly inspired by Barbara and her love of the Homeric vases, is devoted to storytelling, and the objects are arranged in a narrative rather than art historical sequence. And I'll just say that at the time that we opened that, shortly after we opened the gallery, an eminent professor in Greek art, who was on my dissertation committee, came to see the Homer Gallery. He's written many articles and books on myth and art. And he said to me, "But you didn't arrange them chronologically, like according to the date of the objects." And I said, "Alan, only you care about that." No, I mean, I didn't say that, but it really was, it's really oriented to the visitor, and it's really a gallery about storytelling. And it features the strongest concentration of works of art with Homeric scenes in any U.S. art museum. What you're seeing here are 2 highlight vases in front of a large wall case devoted to the Trojan War. And you may be familiar with this, but the Iliad covers only a very small period of time in the overarching, the 10-year siege of Troy by the Greeks, and the other parts of that, what we call the Trojan cycle, we know about from later ancient sources that summarized lost epics, and also through the works of art themselves. And that's really what the gallery is about. Two cases feature objects with scenes from the Odyssey. So you see that on the left. Oh, sorry, it's not your left, it's my left. Highlights in the gallery include a Roman-era portrait on the left, portrait head of the blind Homer, and you see those deeply carved eyes representing his blindness. So this is a type, right, that developed. There was no, well, first of all, we don't really know when Homer lived, if he lived, but let's say there was a single person called Homer who lived around 750 BC. The conception of him, the one thing actually that all the ancient sources agree on is that he was blind. In the Hellenistic period, so the period of art after the reign of Alexander the Great, there was a conception, a visualization of the blind Homer, who has this, and this deep carving underneath his brow, or his, I guess it's the top of his eye bone, is alluding to this inner vision that he has, right? And on the right is a Hellenistic humanizing portrayal of the Cyclops Polyphemus. Also, which you saw on the last slide, are several highlight vases, including this one, which is my favorite object in the entire MFA collection. It's an oversized drinking cup. It's like the size of a small bowl. And it's signed by its potter and its painter, Huron and Macron. And it depicts the Trojan prince Paris abducting Helen of Sparta, the event that would catalyze the Trojan War. On the left, you see the sort of before the beginning of the war, and then on the right, at the end of the war, with Menelaus having arrived in Troy and finding Helen. And it's the draftsmanship in this object is superior to pretty much anything else I've seen in Greek vase painting. And we could go into much more detail about that, but perhaps we'll go on and then we can always come back to it later. The next gallery in this suite focuses on the god of wine, Dionysus, the most frequently represented divinity in Greek art, and the all-male drinking party known as the Symposium held in his honor. As Euripides recounts in his play The Bacchae, Dionysus came from the east and brought with him the fruit of the vine. And the god is seen here in a 4th century marble head, which anchors the gallery, and it's carved so masterfully that its mitra, or headband, appears to like sort of vibrate with vitality. It's just really one of the most beautifully carved marbles in our collection. Winemaking was big business in ancient Greece, as attested archaeologically and on coinage carrying symbols of transport jars. And there's a case in the gallery devoted to trade routes and coinage. Vases for storing, mixing, and consuming wine are among the most frequent objects to survive from Greek antiquity. And you see on the left a large banquet table anchored by a curator. That was the mixing bowl in which wine and water was mixed, or wine was diluted with water, which was one of the hallmarks of Greek drinking, as opposed to other cultures around them. These objects very often feature scenes associated with winemaking, the retinue of Dionysus, so those are the satyrs and maenads who follow him around, making merry, and banqueters performing activities common at the Symposium. And there's a whole case devoted to the Symposium. So they're playing drinking games, reciting poetry, playing music, and making love. The final gallery in this sequence is Greek theater, which segues naturally from the Symposium gallery because Dionysus was also the god of theater. The esteemed Athenian playwright Aeschylus, known as the father of tragedy, is quoted by later ancient sources as referring to his works as the mere leftovers from the great banquet of Homer. The earliest Greek plays were dithyrambics, choral poems, performed in Dionysus's honor at religious festivals. And the gallery features objects associated with and illustrative of dramatic and comedic performances. And the rarest object in the gallery is an early 5th century crater, mixing bowl, representing scenes from the trilogy known as the Oresteia in graphic splendor. On the first side, we witness the murder of Agamemnon as he steps out of his bath, and on the reverse, his son Orestes avenging his father's death by killing his murderer, Aegisthus, who was the lover of Clytemnestra, Orestes' mother. In December 2017, we opened another thematic gallery, which complements those just described. It focuses on daily life in ancient Greece and draws visitors into the past through familiar scenes such as a barber cutting hair in a wonderful small terracotta, children playing with toys, scenes from the everyday lives of men and women, images of artists at work, and utilitarian objects such as loom weights. One highlight in this gallery is an amphora, a storage jar with a rare scene. There are only one or two others, in which a young woman visits a shoemaker for a fitting, you see on the left, and she's attended by her father. Of course, Greek young women did not go around by themselves. It was rather like living in Saudi Arabia, in Athens. On the reverse of the vase, a blacksmith prepares to strike a metal bar with a sledgehammer. Turning to the early Greek gallery, the strength of the MFA's collection of Greek art dating from the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE can't be overstated. It's one of the best outside Greece, and yet this formative period in Greek art is still underappreciated by many. In fact, even referring to it as Greek art is something of a misnomer, because it perpetuates the idea that the Greeks were a monolithic group, when in fact they identified themselves as Athenians, Spartans, Corinthians, Thebans, and so on, and were always in competition with one another, if not at war. Recognizing that most people regard the artistic achievements of 5th century Athens as the acme of Greek art, I sought to rewind the tape, as it were, and to demonstrate to visitors how the qualities that they prize so highly in classical art were actually present in Greek art from its earliest days. Another goal was to renegotiate the remit of the gallery, which was originally conceptualized as a quote-unquote chronological and regional overview of early Greek art. Curatorial practice has evolved quite a bit since 2006, and the overwhelmingly positive response to the thematic galleries just described caused me to think twice about presenting the earlier material in a strictly art historical manner. I worried that I would lose people if I didn't strike the right balance between a chronological regional approach on the one hand and a thematic one on the other. After a lot of consideration and many conversations with colleagues both at the MFA and in the field, and banging my head against the wall for 6 to 9 months, and arranging, I had all the objects, all the photos, this is what curators do. We still do it in physical space. Oftentimes, it's like you cut out a photo of the objects and keep arranging them until something, something coherent presents itself. After all of that, and really with the help of our head of interpretation at the time, Adam Tessier, I devised a 2-part plan. And what you're seeing here in this slide is the introductory space in which we present the development of Greek art along 2 important trajectories: the birth of narrative in the middle of the 8th century and approaches to the human body in the 6th. And I'll say that I was guided to these by thinking about where the gaps were in our previous installations. And I can say a little bit more about that later. The second part of the gallery exposes the tension in early Greek art between firmly held local and regional identities and visual vocabularies, so like ways of representing what you might call style. Some people use that word. On the one hand, so that like attachment to the local, and then on the other hand, the impact of the rapidly expanding horizons of the Greek world through trade and colonization. So let me just say one thing about the colonization, which is it's not colonization in the modern sense of an empire, like of a centrally administered empire sending out, colonizers and controlling from that center, but rather groups of Greeks that we think by the end of the 9th century were moving principally westward because that's where they had more opportunity, because in the East, there were these massive empires, right? And looking for probably economic opportunities for reasons that have been speculated upon in thousands of pages. But, and they were following, and we'll get to this later, on the heels of the Phoenicians who had come from the Levant. So we'll get back to that. The gallery begins by showcasing some of the most important early Greek objects, not just at the MFA, but in the entire world. They are displayed on individual pedestals so that they can be fully appreciated in the round. And I'll say that this was a driving force in the gallery design. And if I could, I would still put more things out in the round, but we did liberate masterpieces that could only be seen frontally, and it's really made, I think, the experience much deeper. Among them are the famed Manteclos Apollo, which has long been regarded, that's on the left, long been regarded as embodying the transition from geometric to archaic art because of its unique combination of planar and rounded forms. The dedicatory inscription on his thighs, which you see in the detail, reads, quote, "Manteclos dedicated me as a tithe, so a tenth, to the far shooter, the bearer of the silver bow. You, Phoebos," me, shining one, "give something pleasing in return," end quote, and attests to the reciprocal relationship that characterized Greek votive religion. To one side of Manteclos, which you see on the right, is a 9-lobed gold libation bowl carrying an inscription saying that it was dedicated by the sons of the Corinthian tyrant Kypselos, with spoils from their exploits at Heraclea, an ancient city that has never been found. So basically what the dedication says is we dedicate, the sons of Kypselos dedicate this, and it basically just says from Heraclea, but it's from the war booty. And it's a thanks offering for success in war, right? So this, again, demonstrating this reciprocal relationship. Quid pro quo, I like to call it. It is the only dedication of its type and material that survives from antiquity. So we know from temple treasuries, there are lists of what the treasuries contained, and we read about other examples, but and there are silver examples that survive, but there are no other gold examples. Excuse me. On the other side of Manteclos is a late archaic bronze statuette of Hermes Kriophoros, the ram bearer. In my experience, in every project there is an object or a handful of objects that reveal themselves to be more captivating, interesting, and or important than I expected. Often they are underappreciated or ignored previously, but sometimes they are the ones that are already celebrated. Sometimes the hype is just totally legitimate. In this gallery, it was Hermes carrying a ram to sacrifice that wouldn't let go of my attention. The exquisite detail in dress and hairstyle, the sensitive attention to musculature, the animation conveyed by the strongly advancing his left leg, But above all, the way that the ram facing perpendicular to Hermes' gaze dynamically expands the force field of the sculpture. The inventive composition breaks with the frontality of archaic sculpture and demands that the spectator move their body to experience it as a fully three-dimensional object. And this is this is one of the great examples of an object that was not, where it was not possible to appreciate it in the round in our previous installation. And I encourage you to go look at it, because it really is, the date is about 500 BC, and it really comes at this moment when thanks to, I mean, this is a small bronze, but bronze casting techniques permitted the expansion of poses in large-scale sculpture, and we see already here this idea of the sculpture starting to engage the space around it, and that's what makes the spectator, like, draws the spectator in, and so that's an example of maybe the high regard for classical art that is already present, and is you can draw sort of a straight line from Manticlaus to this, to those, high achievements of the classical period. And I know that sounds really teleological, but at the same time, I think it is true. Okay. The literal centerpiece of the gallery are the relief sculptures from the 6th century temple of Athena at Assos, which you see positioned overhead on a freestanding post and lintel support. They feature two groups. On the left, Heracles as an archer chasing away a group of centaurs. Here's a detail of that. So you see him, he's second to the left. And on the right, in a detail, are the blocks, and I should just point out that there are 3 fragments that make up this grouping, and the one all the way to the right is actually a cast of the original, which is in, I think, the Louvre. And it represents 2 sphinxes resting their forepaws on what is probably a column representing the city. Sometimes people interpret it as a tree, like the tree of life. Assos was a Greek city located on the western coast of Turkey, modern-day Baramkale, and the volcanic stone temple there dates to about 530 BCE. It was excavated, the site was excavated in the 1880s by the newly founded and still Boston-based, Archaeological Institute of America, which in turn gifted its portion of the finds. So the finds were split up. Some of them remained in Turkey, well, most of them. Some were in the Louvre, and then we got a pretty good share of finds that range from inscriptions to, I mean, these are the biggest stars, but the loom weights in the Daily Life Gallery, inscriptions that speak to the role of citizens, so civic life, terracottas, etc. So we have a wonderful collection from there. As archaeologically pedigreed temple decoration, they constitute a rare holding in an American art museum. And the audacious decision, I dare say, to display them in such a manner on this post and lintel structure in the middle of the room stemmed from my desire to give our visitors a sense of them as part of religious architecture, and to demonstrate how the images overhead mediated between the worlds of the mortal and the divine. And I didn't know that this would happen, but what you're seeing here is, because we added the clear story to the early Greek gallery, shortly after we erected them, and I will say that I was asked very directly if these were worth spending the amount of money that was required to reinforce the floor to be able to accommodate the steel structure. And I knew it was one of these moments in my career where I just had to make a big decision. It it was the director asking me, are these important? And are these important enough to spend this much money on? And I said, yes. And I'm so glad I did, because I went up to the gallery one day, and the light, the natural sunlight was hitting in this raking, with raking light onto the centaurs, and I was able to take a picture, and it was, then you could see how illuminated, how animated the relief sculpture would have been, because the centaurs look like they're about to run right off of the frieze, right? So it really captures the special effects of architectural sculpture in a way that putting them against the wall, I think, never can. In any event, so we also, to help people understand their location on the building and their original context, we commissioned this digital reconstruction of the temple by a digital archaeologist named Massimo Limoncelli of the University of Palermo, and it calls out their original location on the east facade of the temple. And there's much more to say about Assos, but we'll keep going. We can always come back. The Assos frieze serves as the backdrop for the first part of the gallery, which, as I mentioned earlier, is organized chronologically along two themes: approaches to the human body and the birth of narrative in Greek art. The narrative case supports the Homer gallery next door with its focus on storytelling. It begins by highlighting the oldest object in the gallery, a small Athenian pitcher dating to about 900 BCE, a gift from the Greek government to the MFA in 1914. Non-figural, and you see it here, I'm going to go to the next slide. It's on the left. Non-figural, it is decorated with semicircles that were drawn with a compass. And the object in the middle and on the right are two of the earliest figural scenes on Greek pottery. In the middle, and they're both pitchers. They're in the same shape as the other. We call them inokaway. They both feature scenes, activities that were performed by and associated with elites in the 8th century. On the left, a fox hunt, and on the right, a combat scene. So there was a lot of speculation about this scene on the right with the two warriors kind of clasping hands, and underneath a warrior who's upside down. Some scholars speculated that it was an acrobat or a scene of games, but in fact, that upside down figure in early figuration is code for a deceased figure. And I should say something about the object in the middle, which is that you'll notice that there are swastikas painted on it, and I always get asked about these, especially now more than ever, which I'm sad to say. The precise meaning of the swastika in ancient art is not fully known, but they were positive, not negative symbols, and they were not. The symbol was co-opted and misused by the Nazi regime. So no connection to Nazism here. A tiny Corinthian jar for luxurious perfume. So this object, of course, scale is always a challenge when we present in auditoria, and so this. And it was so small because the contents were very luxurious and exotic. Came from Arabia and India and so forth. It deliberately echoes Assyrian art in its depiction of the local Corinthian hero Bellerophon encountering the monster Chimera. So you see that actually in the line in the reconstruction on the right. It's a little easier to see the imagery, but you see these beautiful, guilloche pattern below the figural scene and a chain of lotus palmettes above. And I should say that this is the earliest representation of an identifiable mythological scene in the MFA's collection. It dates to about 650 BC. And so just to explain why I felt that it was important to have this case devoted to the birth of narrative is that in the Homer Gallery, it always gnawed at me that we presented the works there as if the Greek artists always told stories in pictures. And so this was a chance to demonstrate, like, you know, when and how and what were the earliest scenes and so on, to kind of give that foundation, make it clear that they didn't come out of nowhere. The section on approaches to the body features the ideal archaic types of the kouros, the youth, or the male youth, and kore, the maiden or the female youth, and provides the foundation for the activities performed by elite men and women in the daily life gallery. A subtly carved kouros anchors this section, and this is yet another example of an object that's really benefited from being pulled off the wall. You can see on the back this beautifully articulated hair painted in red, and I haven't found another example of a kouros that has hair quite like this one, where there are alternating, like vertically emphasized locks, and then the ones that are just the sort of bulbous examples. So anyway, that's something to further research. The selection and arrangement of objects demonstrate how the types were used flexibly for votive and funerary purposes, and how a range of media made them affordable to less affluent consumers, so terracotta, for example. So too, regional differences in the approach to korai are apparent when seeing the East Greek and mainland examples side by side. And I haven't quite shown them to you side by side because I wanted to help you understand their location in the case, but this is an example probably from Miletus, a city in the Greek East, in East Greece. And here, what we call a caryatid mirror. So they were these mirrors from the end of the archaic into the early classical period that are held up by young women like the caryatids on the Erechtheion many, many years later. Another highlight of the gallery is the rare amphora featuring Heracles driving a bull to sacrifice, called bilingual because it employs both black and red figure vase painting techniques. Paired with it is a 5-minute animated film called Figures in Red, about the invention of the red figure technique in Athens around 530 BCE. The most common audience questions I have received over the years pertain to how Greek vases were made, and they inspired me, along with our colleagues, to make this film. MFA colleagues led by George Sharoun and, at the time, Adam Tessier, and myself chose ZM Media, a Cyprus-based animation studio, to help us tell our story. Two main goals were to conjure, these were my goals, in addition to delivering all of the technical information in a way that was easy for people to access. I'm not a strong science person, and so I always was challenged by the text panels that would explain the multiple phases of firing and the temperatures and the fancy scientific terms, and even though I studied this for years and years and years, I still found it challenging. And so we thought about how we could make this more visually accessible with this information. So that was at a basic level, was to deliver the information in a way that was accessible. But the other two goals were, for me, was to conjure a sense of awe at the moment of creativity of an artist inventing a new technique. So an artist seeing something that, for the first time, something that the rest of us don't see, which is how I think of art, what artists do in whatever medium they work in, is like they have some, and it goes back to Homer too, right? This inner vision, this ability to make something, to realize something of their own creation. And the second goal was to impart a feeling of reverence for the centuries of dogged experimentation and resulting technical expertise in the firing techniques that allowed for this very high contrast red and black brand, to use that very popular term, of Athenian vases. And so one thing you'll see, I'm going to play the animation now, is that what's so remarkable about these high contrast objects, the high contrast aesthetic of Athenian black and red figure vases, is that it's all achieved with just clay. So it is really something of beauty. So we'll go ahead and play that now.
Welcome to Athens. 2,500 years ago, this is the neighborhood where Athenian vase makers lived and worked. It's called the Keramikos, the origin of the English word ceramic. Meet Antokides, a highly regarded master potter. This is his workshop. In the 6th century BCE, Athenian vases were prized far and wide for their superior shapes and designs. Their glossy black images stood out against a red background. This painting technique that we now call black figure was passed down from master to apprentice for generations.
Good morning, boss.
Good morning. Careful there, Simon.
Yes, sir. Here's yesterday's batch. Polished and primed for painting.
Very good. Your burnishing skills have improved. Now, it's time to paint. Where's that slip we prepared a few days ago?
Slip is essential to the vase's distinctive look. It's made by mixing together clay, water, and a special chemical that helps the smaller clay particles rise to the top. That slurry becomes the slip. He applies the slip with a brush and then carves fine details with a pointed stylus.
Precision and detail make stories come alive. You see here, this figure is now just a man. But once you add the lion skin and the knotted club...
Heracles!
Exactly.
The workshops of the Keramikos favored black figure for most of the 6th century. Until one day.
Simon, hold it there.
We don't know exactly when it happened or what inspired it.
I'm seeing something.
But one visionary potter had a brilliant idea.
Bring me the thinnest brush you can find. I'm going to try something new on this side.
Antokides begins to apply the slip to the background, leaving the figures untouched.
Boss, you're painting the wrong part.
This time, he paints the details with a fine brush.
Why didn't I think of this before? All right, Simon, it's time to fire up the kiln.
Right away.
Inside the kiln, the slip will transform. Firing is done in 3 stages. First, the vase is baked to bring out the red color of the clay. Next, damp wood is added to the fire. The kiln's vent is closed and the heat increases. The lack of oxygen turns the vase black and the slip becomes glassy. Finally, the kiln's vent is reopened. As the temperature drops, the unpainted surface turns red once more, while the slip-painted designs remain black.
Wow.
Simon, let's show our merchant friend our latest creation.
Oh my, what on earth?
I call it Figures in Red.
The finest Athenian craftsmanship.
The pictures, you've brought them to life. I want at least a dozen in this new style. My customers will love them.
And just like that, red figure vases took the Greek world by storm, surpassing black figure in popularity.
Job well done, boss.
Millennia later, tens of thousands of black figure and red figure vases survive. But vases like this one, that show both styles at once, these are extremely rare.
Remember this, Simon. A great artist is always looking for new ways to tell their story.
So as the credits are rolling, I will just say that I found making this film to be enormously creatively rewarding. I felt closer to the artists than I had ever felt in all my years of study, and that's largely because we were trying to figure out how to tell our story, and in doing that, facing some of the same challenges that they were facing in their medium. Of course, we were telling the story. It was very meta because we were telling the story of the invention of a new graphic technique through the graphic medium of our time. But also, we did make. We're often looking at scenes from myth or whatever it is, especially on vases, and saying, well, why did they do this, and why didn't they include that, and why, and for example, I think this film gives the impression that our bilingual amphora was the first red figure vase, which is not true. There were probably many trial pieces, and this was probably a showpiece once it was, quite well understood, except we had to tell the story about our object. So it's not that it's not true, it's just that we had to make certain sacrifices for our audience to make a coherent story. So I think about that all the time now when I look at ancient vases. Okay, so I'm gonna pick up the pace a little bit so that we have time for questions. The larger space of the gallery explores the tension in early Greek art between closely held local and regional identities and the expansion of Greek horizons through trade and colonization, all against the backdrop of the emergence of the Greek city-state as a distinct, in some cases self-governed, political entity. This is the aspect of early Greece that since my college days I have found most inspiring. And yet the emergence of the city-state is not something easily illustrated with a collection mostly acquired via the antiquities market, except for that Assos material, which I spoke about earlier. In the background of this photo is a case highlighting, let me go to the next photo, is a case highlighting the stylistic diversity of early Greek art in 3 different regions, plus the island of Cyprus, which is not a region of Greece, but has its own unique culture. The groupings exemplify the specific visual vocabularies of each and the common purposes the shapes and objects were used for in their everyday and ritual functions. The MFA is particularly rich in art from an area called East Greece by archaeologists. As early as the 10th century BCE, mainland Greeks immigrated to the western coast of modern Turkey and the nearby Greek islands, so I'm thinking of Samos, Chios, Lesbos, and Rhodes. Residents in the cosmopolitan cities that developed there interacted with neighboring cultures, including the rich Anatolian kingdoms of Lydia and Phrygia. And this is something we'll see later, that searching for economic opportunities, Greeks from this region founded the city of Naucratis in the Nile Delta at the end of the 7th century. Proximity to these established cultures affected not only the look of East Greek art, but also the materials and forms employed. For example, the distinctive metalwork seen in elaborate groupings of ornaments, some with protective imagery adapted from Near Eastern art, were sewn into funerary shrouds and headgear, adorning and protecting the remains of the deceased. They were made using a technique known as repoussé, pushed up, literally, in French, which involves painstakingly hammering the designs from the reverse side. And this careful technique was utilized to create the figural imagery on these electrum plaques. Electrum is just a gold that has a high silver content. Differing regional approaches in early Greece are also apparent in the form of funerary monuments, from ceramic vessels that once contained cremated remains, human remains, to vessels and stone stelae that served as grave markers. And one of the most popular objects in the MFA Ancient Collection is the lion from Perachora, which is a cemetery near Corinth, now positioned finally so that its magnificent mane can be appreciated. Another is a sphinx atop a volute. You see it here on the left. I'm going to give you a detail of it, or a fuller view of it. In this photo, and this object retains much of its original polychromy. It comes from a site called Vari along the Attic coast, and that was a real an aristocratic outpost. It may be that it once topped the same monument, the monument that you see on the right, which is a stele called the Warrior Stele at the Met. They came through the same dealer around the same time. They have the same level of polychromy preserved, probably because they didn't stand outside for very long. They date to the end of the 6th century, and it was just around that time that there were these anti-aristic factions going around Athens, and they may have been buried purposefully to prevent them from harm. Okay, we're going to go back one slide, sorry. Object conservation has played a critical role in all these gallery renovations. The condition of every single object is assessed, carefully documented, and treated for structural and aesthetic reasons as needed. The most significant treatment performed for this gallery, and it is still ongoing, but we're nearly there, is the restoration of a ceramic sarcophagus rim made in the city of Clazomenae, which is near modern-day Izmir or Smyrna. And you see it in the background here. Over 100 of these coffins exist, and here you see one in situ, so you see that it was the rim for a ceramic coffin, and more are being discovered. At least this excavation is from not too long ago. Few of them are in American museum collections. The Princeton has a massive one. The Met and the Getty each have one. The MFA's example had been in storage for nearly so this is not the MFA example. I'm just showing you a photo from the excavator of this site from a fairly recent excavation. The MFA's example had been in storage for nearly 2 decades when we brought it up to conservation to be examined in 2019. It had substantial losses, so what you're seeing here is a before and after photo of almost after, because we're not quite there yet, but the most recent photos. So you're seeing on the top the before and then below with work done. It had substantial losses in the head and the foot piece. This is the head piece, and that rendered the imagery very difficult to read. And so with careful research, a tremendous amount of patience, and really, truly outstanding hand skills and artistic skills, conservator Leanne Gordon has been able to fill in some of the gaps to make the scenes more legible. And what you're seeing is that her work revealed a beautifully tender scene in the center of this headpiece with a warrior who has this big helmet. Let me see if this laser pointer works. Does it work? Whoops, no, I did something wrong. I knew that was going to happen. Right here, right, that giant, this is the main figure. And he's saying goodbye to his wife, who's holding their smallest child. And then one of the children is sort of tugging at his waist there, or just below. And then the oldest one is helping to load the big shield onto the chariot, right? Also, and I'll try to project, and this is really hard to see, we're going to do a line drawing of it, but this is actually a quadriga of 4 horses, and the one that's closest to us is, we see in profile, okay? Then there's this one, and we see his like diamond, marking on his face. He's frontal, and then the other 2, which is, I mean, Leanne and I have to look so careful. There are 2 horse heads here that are in like, 3/4 view. So it's really a very sophisticated, representation of a quadriga, creating all this space and 3-dimensionality. I could go on about this, but this is the family saying goodbye to the warrior is obviously a very suitable scene for a funerary, for a coffin. And on the bottom, we'll just do this quickly, is an animal combat scene, so a bull being overtaken by 2 felines. Okay. The centerpiece of the second half of the gallery is a case that is tripartite in concept. The front features a map with objects embedded to visualize the transmission of objects and ideas via trade beginning in the 9th century. And the map makes it possible to see the trade routes and follow object biographies. For example, on the right, a monkey-shaped perfume flask made in Rhodes, heavily influenced by Egypt, both in material and iconography, and found in the Bay of Naples at the Greek city of Cumae. And this allows visitors, the map allows visitors to appreciate how truly global the world has been for a very long time. And again, this is another example of being friendlier to varying learning styles by presenting some of the material visually, not just in text. 2 groupings of objects on the other side of the case explore related themes. The first is alphabetic writing, the principal technology that the Greeks adopted from their trading partners, the Phoenicians. And the appearance of writing in Greece is much debated, when and why, but it probably was by the end of the 9th century. And I think there are pretty strong arguments to suggest that it was adopted for the purpose of writing names on cargo. So we think that they adopted it from trading partners, and probably in some of the places, both in the East and possibly in the West, that they were working side by side. Because there's such a strong impulse in Greece to name objects, as we'll see in just a moment. The earliest Greek writing survives in the form of inscriptions on objects, and the MFA has examples dating back to 700 BCE, and one of them is Manteclaus. We have other examples. I really wanted in this case for people to appreciate what early Greek writing said and who it was for. So there are basically 3 different kind of categories of inscriptions. One is, as you see in Manteclaus, a votive inscription, and you see this here on different objects. On the right, a votive bull dedicated at the sanctuary devoted to the Cuberioi, and outside of Thebes, who are gods that are not fully understood, but have something to do with Dionysus. And there were 400 or 500 of these bulls found, small bull figurines found there, possibly having to do with some kind of initiation ritual. So it carries the name of the dedicator and who it's for. And on the left, these are fragments from Naucratis, from the sanctuary of Aphrodite there, and we see the goddess's name on one of the sherds, and then the main verb to dedicate in the sherd on the right. And then the other 2 categories, one, I don't have an image of this, but there are inscribed marble fragments that are said to have belong to the same monument as the Sphinx that preserve a funerary epitaph, so talk about give the name of the deceased and why he was, praiseworthy and all that, but it's very fragmentary. And then finally, artist signatures. So one of the earliest artist signatures in Greek art is on this, again, tiny, tiny little vessel that was found in, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the site, found in a site in Italy, and is signed as being, and it has one of these patronymic inscriptions, which names not just the artist, but the father of the artist, and is probably, we call it Etrusco-Corinthian, but never mind that. Oh, it's from Cumae, just like the other object. Anyway, so there's this strong tradition in Greek art from a fairly early time of artists signing their works. They're not usually the names that survive in the literature, which is something that's paradoxical, but Greek art is unique in this way among its peers at the time. So in the Near East and Egypt, not common, or even not even sure there are examples of artists signing their works. Okay. Lastly, the second theme of this case is the representation of the peoples that the Greeks came into contact with beyond the mainland and their varied attitudes towards foreigners. On the one hand, the Greeks were genuinely curious about other peoples, and on the other hand, they invented the word xenophobia for a reason. The objects in this case mostly date to the late 6th century in Athens, Athens at that time was a very multicultural city. There are at least 20 foreign cults that have been documented in its port city of Piraeus, and there are many examples of vase makers in Athens who sign their works with the use of ethnic identifiers, such as the Syrian, the Lydian. One even signed a trustworthy foreigner. We have many examples. One of the peoples who most fascinated the Greeks were those they called Ethiopians, Greek for blaze-faced, because the Greeks attributed skin color to environmental factors. So like sun exposure. Herodotus describes them as living south of Egypt and as beautiful, long-lived people with great longevity. Ethiopians are mentioned in Greek poetry as early as Homer, having their king, Memnon, having fought on the side of the Trojans, and are represented in Greek art beginning in the middle of the 6th century. The face-shaped vessels you see in this photo are presumed to represent Ethiopians, and they were used in elite activities such as athletics. In the example on the, well, it's confusing, but the smaller example is another one of these perfume jars to contain luxurious perfumes. And in the larger example, a drinking cup used in the all-male parties known as Symposia held in honor of Dionysus. By way of conclusion, I'd like to touch on an aspect of this project that is vitally important: the engagement of younger generations. With my colleagues in the creative and learning and community engagement departments, I created a short video featuring the perspectives of 5 Boston area college students on the relevance of ancient art, why museums matter, and their hopes for the future. College students are the bridge between youth and adults, and as interlocutors between the museum and our audiences, have the greatest potential to appeal to a wide spectrum of visitors. Throughout the video, the 5 students touch on broad themes of the relevance of ancient art embedded in the galleries. They include how and why societies tell stories through their art, the culturally determined nature of ideals and why ideals persist so powerfully, the motivations behind and the sources of artistic innovation, the tensions in society between the receptivist receptiveness to and the rejection of the new and unfamiliar. And finally, the obvious and not so obvious ways that social status expresses itself in art and material culture. In a world in which museums are expected to be more responsive to their audiences than ever, and with a collection that has the potential to speak to so many different aspects of human experience, it's critical that we listen to the voices of impassioned young people. These galleries are for them and those who come after. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
we have a mic right here. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and I can come to you.
I see one in the front.
I noticed that when you show these masks of perfume, they seem to be, this is a minion question, but just wondering your comments. They seem to be quite big compared to the new little perfume bottles that one buy in the stores of the Paris, the bottles of perfume. Were baths readily available, or did they need a lot of perfume to mask all the smells?
Good question. So So these perfume jars are quite small. They look big on the screen, but when you go to the gallery, they're very often just a few inches. Everything that we understand suggests that they were quite expensive luxury items. Baths, like public baths, are not something that were not amenities that were available in this period of Greek art. So the phenomenon of Roman baths and Hellenistic bathing culture, that's something that happens much later. But there's quite a lot. But these were elite. They were the possessions of elites. For men, they would use what are these perfumed oils at the gym, at the gymnasium. But of course, if you were exercising in the gymnasium, it meant you didn't have, to be laboring in the field, right? So this was and similarly for women, the beautification of Greek women to entice, inspire desire in their husbands for whom they were, arranged in marriages to. It probably did distinguish, nice-smelling people from the ordinary folk. Yeah. So, good question. Of course, they could bathe in rivers and streams and all of that, right? I mean, that's really what we hear about.
It was interesting to hear about your decision-making on
thank
all
you.
sorts of things. But I was wondering, what is so special about the glass cabinets from Milan?
Oh, good question. So what's so special about them? The glass disappears, and you just can see the objects and appreciate them. I totally notice the difference between plexiglass and regular glass. Now there's something called Optium plexi that is non-reflective, but actually when we did the Homer Gallery, let me just say that as a curator, the casework is not up to me. It's the budget of the project that drives what we're able to do, the designer and our exhibitions team. But I appreciate them because that it just falls away. And so I remember actually when we put out the Macron Skyphos, with the abduction of Helen, I had been studying it in storage, and I was so sad to put it on view because I wouldn't be able to get up close to it. And then we put it on view in one of those Gopion pedestal cases, And I realized now everybody had that access. And so I was convinced from then on that we should stick with Copion. There are issues, but we've used them since I think the first ones, Barbara, you have a longer institutional memory than I do, but I think it was for the American wing. And then we've had a pretty good experience and great response to them since. And they're still competitive with American prices. We do bid it out every time, and yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.